Hello, everybody, and welcome to WorldAware's webinar on the Boeing 737 MAX. I'm Max Leitschuh, a Senior Transportation Intelligence Analyst here at WorldAware. Now, we do have some breaking news just as we start here. I've just seen some reports that President Trump has announced that the U.S. will also be grounding the Boeing 737 MAX. So a couple of slides you see in this presentation will be a little bit out of date, but we'll still work with that. So just a quick outline of what we'll cover in this webinar. We'll start with some background on the 737 MAX and why airlines and authorities are worried about the plane. We'll then take a quick look at what we know and what we don't know about the crash in Ethiopia this Sunday, before we move on to talk about the groundings of the 737 MAX that we've seen around the world. Finally, we'll provide some insight into what WorldAware expects to happen with the global 737 MAX fleets, including some timelines for the most likely outcomes. So just to give you the bottom line up front, WorldAware is recommending that travelers strongly consider avoiding flying on the 737 MAX until we know more about what happened in the Ethiopian crash. Well, at this point, travelers really aren't going to have much choice because basically all 737 MAX aircraft have been grounded. That advice applies to both the 737 MAX 8 and the 737 MAX 9. That advice does not apply to older models of the 737, including the 737-800 and the 737-900. Those are not part of the 737 MAX family. We do not have any outstanding concerns about flying on those older models. So we'll start with some background on the 737 MAX. The Boeing 737 entered service in 1968 and is the most successful jet airliner ever built. The aircraft has gone through 4 generations, with the MAX being the newest generation. The MAX family entered service in May 2017, and prior to the recent groundings, there were about 370 of them in service worldwide. The 2 variants of the MAX in service are the 737 MAX 8 and the slightly larger 737 MAX 9. There's also a MAX 7 and a MAX 10 model, but those aren't in service yet. Now there's over 7,000 737s in service right now, so those 370 MAXs are a pretty small portion of the global 737 fleet. The vast majority of 737s in service are from what's called the 737 Next Generation, which was built from the mid-90s up until today. That's the 737-600, 700, 800, and 900. Those planes are not affected by the issues that are affecting the 737 MAX right now. And the first sign of trouble for the 737 MAX came when a 737 MAX 8 operating Lion Air Flight 610 crashed off the coast of Indonesia shortly after takeoff from Jakarta in October 2018, killing all 189 people on board. After that crash, Boeing issued a bulletin to operators outlining a system in the 737 MAX's flight controls called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. To make a very long story short, the MCAS uses the plane's trim system to push the plane's nose down if it thinks the plane's nose is too high. This happens without any pilot input. In theory, it's a good system to have. It helps keep the plane out of an aerodynamic stall, and stalls can cause crashes. But there's 2 problems with the MCAS. First, it works off data from a single sensor at any time. So if that sensor is faulty and says the plane's nose is high when it's actually level, the MCAS will push the plane's nose down when it's in level flight. The pilots can pull the plane back up and reset the trim, but the MCAS will activate again 5 seconds later and push the nose back down, and keep doing so every time the pilots pull it back up. The solution to all this is for the pilots to turn off the automatic trim system, which is a fairly simple thing to do if they know they're supposed to do it. But that brings us to the second problem with the MCAS, which is that Boeing did a poor job of documenting it. After Boeing's bulletin came out, a lot of 737 MAX operators and pilots said they'd never heard of the system, including pilots at Southwest Airlines and American Airlines. Boeing had approved pilot training courses for the 737 MAX that didn't mention the MCAS. So if you put those 2 issues together, you got situations where a plane kept pushing its nose down, and the pilots had no idea why, and no specific instructions on how to stop it. That appears to be what happened in the Lion Air flight in Indonesia. The MCAS activated about 30 times in 10 minutes on that flight until the plane finally crashed. There were other problems that Indonesia crash as well, and WorldAware actually downgraded Lion Air in our WorldAware airline monitor in response to some of those problems. But the data is pretty clear that the MCAS played a role in the crash. After that crash, Boeing, regulators, Airlines made a big push to rectify that second problem about the lack of documentation, and they notified pilots of the MCAS and trained them on how to resolve erroneous MCAS activations. There was a sense in the aviation community that this was enough to prevent the MCAS from being a threat anymore. Like I said, the procedure for stopping the MCAS is pretty simple, and there was a belief that any 737 MAX pilot would immediately follow that procedure if their plane ever nosed over when it shouldn't. According to some reports, 2 737 MAX flights in the US may have experienced erroneous MCAS activations in the past few months. The pilots dealt with those incidents appropriately, but the details on those supposed incidents are pretty sketchy. So it was against all that backdrop that an Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 8 operating Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed shortly after takeoff from Addis Ababa this past Sunday, killing all 157 people on board. There is still very little information available regarding that crash. We have some eyewitness reports, some snippets of data from Flight Radar 24, a flight tracking website, and some information from Ethiopian CEO saying that the pilots reported control issues shortly before the crash. For various reasons, I wouldn't regard any of those snippets as being very reliable. In a very broad sense, the Ethiopian crash looks similar to the Indonesian one, but we don't have any firm evidence indicating that the Ethiopian crash was related to an MCAS issue. Some of those snippets of information we have are consistent with an MCAS issue, some are not. We don't have enough evidence to say either way right now. But the airline industry is a very risk-averse industry. And with that backdrop of the Indonesian crash, a lot of regulators and airlines have decided to take a very cautious approach and ground the 737 MAX until we have a better idea of what happened in the Ethiopian crash. So that brings us all to what is happening today, which is changing minute by minute. Nearly every airline that operates 737 MAX has grounded the aircraft, either by their own choice or because their country's regulator has ordered them to do so. Some countries have also banned the 737 MAX from their airspace. The most recent move had come this morning when Canadian authorities ordered Canadian carriers to ground the aircraft and ban it from Canadian airspace. But just as we were coming online here, we saw reports that the US appears to be doing the same as well. Now, as you may have picked up earlier in this presentation, both the Indonesian and Ethiopian crashes involved the 737 MAX 8. So some countries have only grounded the MAX 8 model, while others have grounded both the MAX 8 and the MAX 9. From a safety perspective, the planes are basically identical. Both have the MCAS, so grounding one but not the other doesn't make a lot of sense. The biggest exception to this had been the US, although like I said, that appears to be changing as we speak. Panama is another country that has continued to allow 737 MAX operations. I haven't seen any official word from the Panamanian authorities yet, but my sense is that if the US is indeed grounding the 737 MAX, then Panama will follow that example as well. And that will basically leave no 737 MAX operators in the world right now. All of these groundings haven't had a major impact on global air travel. As I said earlier, the 737 MAX makes up a small portion of the global 737 fleet. The older 737 models don't have the MCAS, so there's no threat of them being grounded over this issue. The biggest 737 MAX operators have large overall fleets, so most should have plenty of aircraft to cover their 737 MAX routes. If they still have gaps in their schedule, they can lease in aircraft to cover those gaps, which is a fairly common practice in the aviation world. Travelers might see some sporadic cancellations or delays, especially in the next couple of days, but extensive disruptions are unlikely. There are a few airlines that operate the 737 MAX on routes that none of their other aircraft are suited to. The best example of that is probably Norwegian, using the plane on transatlantic routes. They've had to cancel some flights or use some seriously outsized aircraft on those routes, but those cases are very few and far between. So what will happen next with the 737 MAX? The answer to that will depend on the information we get from the Ethiopian aircraft's flight data recorder, one of the famous black boxes. Ethiopian authorities have recovered the black boxes from the crash site, and they're in the process of deciding which country they want to send them to, since they don't have the tools they need to extract the data themselves. Apparently they're going to be sending them to Europe right now, but supposedly Germany has said that they don't want to be involved. MCAS issues show up very clearly in flight data recorder readings, so as soon as that data is available, we should know whether the Ethiopian crash was related to that issue. I'm expecting we'll have that information within the next 2 weeks. If the MCAS played a role in the Ethiopian crash, I would expect the 737 MAX to remain grounded worldwide until Boeing gets its comprehensive update for the MCAS certified. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but Boeing has said the timeline for that is, quote, no later than April. If the data from the Ethiopian crash shows that the MCAS had nothing to do with the crash, then I would expect all regulators and airlines who have grounded the 737 MAX to lift their groundings. If that happens, WorldAware will also lift our recommendation that travelers avoid flying on the 737 MAX. As I mentioned a second ago, Boeing has been working on an update to the MCAS system for the past few months. While we don't know all the details about that update, I would expect it to fix the issues that have led to the erroneous MCAS activations. One source I read said Boeing wanted to have that update ready to go in January, but has been delayed for various reasons. Boeing issued a statement yesterday saying that they expect to have it certified no later than April, and we'll see if the findings from the Ethiopian crash affect that timeline. So just to reiterate WorldAware's advice on this, which is becoming a bit redundant now that the US has grounded the 737 MAX, WorldAware is recommending that travelers strongly consider avoiding flying on the 737 MAX until we know more about what has happened in the Ethiopian crash. That advice applies to both the 737 MAX 8 and the 737 MAX 9. That advice does not apply to older models of the 737, including the 737-800 and 737-900. Those are not part of the 737 MAX family. We do not have any outstanding concerns about flying on those older models. So that concludes our presentation, and I think we should have time for some questions.
Thank you for the overview, Max. We do have a few minutes to answer questions. If you haven't already, please use the chat feature to the right of your screen to submit questions. While you're submitting your questions, I wanted to bring attention to the special report WorldAware published on this topic. To read the full report, visit worldaware.com. So it looks like we did have a couple of questions that came in. One is, if available, please provide information about how passengers can change already booked flights on the 737 MAX 8 or 9 equipment to regular 737-800s or similar. This would have applied for Southwest, American, and United, but has that changed now that the US has grounded these planes?
Well, yes, I think that since airlines have grounded the aircraft, the passengers won't have to worry about that in the near term. Now, if they're still nervous about flying on the aircraft after any grounding is lifted, then they could contact the airline directly. I would recommend that. Usually when you're booking a ticket, you can see what type of equipment the flight will be operated by. But as of now, with the aircraft being grounded, the airlines will be doing it themselves and going in and replacing any 737 MAX flights with flights on other aircraft, at least until the grounding is lifted.
So essentially the airlines are bringing in new aircraft to take the place of these MAX flights.
They'll be using other aircraft in their fleets to operate the flights in question. Either that or they'll simply have to cancel the flights if they don't have the other aircraft available.
Okay, great. Another question is, can you advise on how people can tell if they're on any of these, if they've been booked on any of these aircraft and might have their air travel disrupted?
So I would look closely at the itinerary that they have with the airline, the itinerary that the airline sent directly to them. That almost always has information on the type of aircraft that is operating the flight. And the 737 MAX is coded differently from previous models of 737, so there will be a distinction there. It will show up as a 737 MAX flight as opposed to a 737-800 or 737-900 flight. If they see 800 or 900, then they're on one of the older models, which is not the concern here.
Essentially, since there is a global grounding on these types of aircraft, most of these concerns, have already been addressed. Is that accurate?
Yes, I'm not aware of any airline that's going to continue operating again, with the exception of Copa, who I think will probably do their own grounding pretty soon. There's not going to be any other airlines that I'm aware of operating the aircraft in the near future.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that we had. It looks like your presentation addressed many of our listeners' concerns and questions, but if you should think of any in the future, please contact us here at WorldAware. Email customer service, all one word, at worldaware.com, and we'll see that your questions get to Max or any of our other subject matter experts.
Okay, and thank you to everybody for listening in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Max, and thank you everyone for attending.